morning. What a delight it is for me to welcome you all here. So it's so good to have you here. This conference has been long in the planning, and it's great to see it happening today. There are so many excellent and really interesting people here. Thank you all for being here, and I hope you'll have time to interact richly with one another. My name is Bernard Prusak, and I've been this conference's principal organizer. I want to take this opportunity to thank as well a number of other people who have done a lot of work. So I'd like to thank my colleagues on the conference organizing committee. I'd like to thank Father Tom Looney, my primary collaborator. We've had many a meeting, and I think I've copied Tom on at least 1,000 emails. I'd like to thank Father Dan Issing, the organizer of the Moreau Lectures, Joan Blewett for her work with the hotel, Michelle Giovanoli, Director of Academic and Institutional Grants, John McAndrew, Director of Public Relations, Brian Blight for the program and for his artwork that graces its cover, Mary Wood, A.J. Sutton, Sam Falbo, and especially Raylyn Barrett for her great diligence and competence in putting together this event. I'd also like to thank Bishop Joseph Bambera for joining us this morning. I'd like to thank Father Jack Ryan and Joe Yvonne and Neil Bukevich for institutional support. And finally, our generous donors, Charles and Mary Parente, whose gift made this conference possible to begin with. I'd also be remiss not to thank my wife, who's here somewhere. She's here in her professional capacity for Catholic Relief Services. And I'd like to acknowledge my dad, the other Bernard Prusak. So some people here know Bernard Prusak and wonder why he's moved from Villanova to King's. Which could make sense, but nonetheless, I'm Bernard the younger, he's Bernard the elder, by implication. This conference comes at an important time, if not a pivotal time, for King's College, as perhaps for other institutions represented here, and Catholic higher education more generally. At King's, we're now revising our mission statement. We're undertaking what might prove to be a major review of our core curriculum. We're adjusting to changing demographics in a challenging market and economy. We're responding to the escalating demands of accrediting agencies. And finally, we're coming to terms with an explosion in the number of applicants to some of our professional programs, coupled with really a striking decline in the number of students majoring in the humanities and social sciences. It's a live question, then, what our college will look like in 10 years. In thinking about my hopes for this conference, I've come back again and again to both the apostolic exhortation of Pope Francis and his wonderful interview published in English in the magazine America. Francis contrasts trying to dominate space with giving priority to time. By trying to dominate space, he means trying to occupy all the spaces and positions of power, and also trying to crowd out all opposition, which in the end is impossible. By contrast, giving priority to time means for him being concerned with initiating processes rather than possessing spaces. What we need, he goes on, is to give priority to actions which generate new processes in society and engage other persons in groups who can develop these processes to the point where they bear fruit, without anxiety, but with clear convictions and tenacity. So there I propose is our charge for these 2 days, to see if we can't initiate processes that, duly cultivated and encouraged, might bring new life to our institutions. I'd like now to introduce the president of King's College, Father Jack Ryan.
Thank you, Bernard, and good morning to students, faculty, administrators, staff, for various members of religious orders, my brothers in Holy Cross, clerics, Bishop Bambera, welcome. I certainly want to add my word of appreciation to all those individuals mentioned by Bernard, and I would add one that he didn't mention, and that is Bernard himself. No one has worked with more energy and more diligence on helping bring about the idea of a Catholic conference than Bernard has. Thank you, Bernard. Parenthetically, Bernard has told me that he will not be doing this task anytime soon. In thinking about this conference, I was reminded of a question posed by Chicago's Francis Cardinal George in his book, The Difference God Makes. While walking about the Chancery in Chicago, Cardinal George was observing the various individuals working on different tasks and jobs, and he said to himself, would we be doing anything differently if God didn't exist? And to rephrase that question, I thought to myself, would we here at King's College be doing anything differently if we weren't a Catholic college? That is, what differentiates Catholic higher education? It is to that question that we set aside time to listen, to speak, and to deliberate on that question. To begin this conversation, it is a special pleasure to welcome Father John Jenkins, President of Notre Dame, and my confrere in the Congregation of Holy Cross. Allow me just to read a small portion from his biography. Elected in 2005 as Notre Dame's 17th president, Father John Jenkins, C.S.C., has devoted himself to fostering the University of Notre Dame's unique place in academia, the church, our nation, and the world. A philosopher trained in theology with undergraduate and advanced degrees from both his alma mater, Notre Dame, and from Oxford University, where he was awarded a doctorate in philosophy, Father Jenkins has been committed to combining teaching and research excellence with a cultivation of the deeper purposes of Catholic higher education. While pursuing academic distinction, he has brought about renewed emphasis to Notre Dame's distinctive mission, rooted in the tradition of the Congregation of Holy Cross, the university's founding community, to educate the whole person, mind, body, and spirit, to do good in the world. Please join me in welcoming Father John Jenkins.
Glad it wasn't too long. Well, thank you, Jack, and thanks all of you for being here. Really great to see all of you, and it's great to be here at King's. I'm an admirer of King's for many reasons. For its exemplary work of living the vision of the founder of Holy Cross, Blessed Basil Moreau, who, as Jack mentioned, believed that education must be a matter of both mind and heart, instilling both a love of truth and a yearning for justice. King's, as its alumnus, and my confrere and friend, Father Thomas O'Hara, recently reminded me, was founded in 1946 to educate the sons of coal miners here in the Wyoming Valley. At King's, Holy Cross Religious taught those whose economic circumstances may have otherwise excluded opportunities that others take for granted. And to this day, some 40% of its students are among the first generation of families to attend college. King's is also known for the focus it puts on ethics and students' moral development in the curriculum. And the McGowan Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility, under the leadership of Dr. Prusak here, is but the most visible expression of this commitment. I hope this forum provides some useful ideas for the King's community, but I begin by recognizing how your example here at King's is an instruction and an inspiration to the rest of us. In his excellent introduction to this conference, The Idea of a Catholic College Charism, Curricula, and Community, Dr. Prusak identifies the challenges that Catholic colleges and universities face today. He contrasts Pope John XXIII's, quote, trust in the hidden intentions of divine providence, leading us beyond our own expectations and even overcoming our feelings and flaws into a new order of things, unquote, with the less sanguine voices about the prospects for Catholic colleges and universities. One example of the latter is Catholic Higher Education, A Culture in Crisis by Father John Pitteret and Melanie Moray, who write that the optimism and enthusiasm of administrators of Catholic colleges and universities about their institutions is unfounded. My own view is that while the challenges are significant, they are not surprising in the present context. One can argue that Catholic colleges and universities are in no greater crisis than the church in our society, and I will suggest there are opportunities if we're willing to seize them. Such opportunities are discerned in reflection on the intersection of our mission and objectives and on the possibilities present in the current cultural and academic context, and I want to gauge in such reflection with you this morning. I'll organize my reflections in three parts. The first is on the past of Catholic colleges and universities in this country. Then the second part is on the broader cultural context in which we live. And then the third part is on looking toward the future for Catholic higher education institutions. I warn you a little bit, this is a wonderfully diverse audience, and my remarks were kind of written for an academic audience. So some of it's heavy sledding, but I'm going to gloss it a bit, so I hope everyone can follow it. So, first of all, looking back the neo-scholastic heritage. Let me begin by saying something about my own intellectual history and interests. I am a philosopher, and my greatest philosophical hero is Thomas Aquinas. His writings have been the heart of my scholarly work, and I'm wary of philosophical labels. I often think they obscure more than illuminate, but if I had to choose one, I would call myself a Thomist. I began to fall in love with the thought of Aquinas in my senior year at Notre Dame in 1975 in a class taught by a great Thomist, Ralph McInerney. I was a philosophy major. And though I'd never lost my faith, I was struggling with questions about God's existence. Though I probably was not able to articulate it at the time, I was searching for an understanding of God that did not make him an anthropomorphic and implausible add-on to a world we already knew. Encountering Aquinas in Professor McInerney's class was an intellectual epiphany for me. When I worked through a careful reading of the first half of the first part of the Summa Theologiae, the light went on. Here was an attempt to speak of a God distinct from creation, a God who transcends our understanding, a God who, in Aquinas' words, we understand insofar as we understand that we do not understand him. I learned from the doctrine of analogy, the manner in which we can speak intelligibly of God, from Professor McInerney, who was a novelist and had a keen sense for the subtle elasticity of language. With time and further study, I came to appreciate in Aquinas' thought the harmony of the ways in which God can be understood through faith and reason. And I came to see the disputed question form in Aquinas' writing in the Summa, not as some antiquated stylistic convention, but as an expression of the essentially dialogical, open-ended character of his thought. Aquinas' response to a question was an attempt at resolution in light of the strongest objections in the tradition to that position, but the response was always open to a further objection, a further question. I continue to learn from reading his works. I mention that not only so that you will know about me, but also to make a point that this fresh and exciting discovery of the thought of Aquinas would not have been possible, I believe, at Notre Dame 20 years earlier, or perhaps even 10 years earlier. This is ironic, as I'm sure some of you realize, because in earlier decades at Notre Dame, the philosophy department and philosophy classes would have been dominated by Thomists and Thomism. So why do I say that this discovery would not have been possible then? In his excellent book, Contending with Modernity, Catholic Higher Education in the 20th Century, the historian Philip Gleason suggests that it was the heritage of Thomism and what came to be called neo-scholastic philosophy and theology that gave Catholic colleges their intellectual coherence and distinctiveness up to the 1960s. Neo-scholasticism was inspired by Pope Leo XIII's 1879 encyclical, Aeterni Patris. Written after the First Vatican Council, it made the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas more or less the official Catholic philosophical and theological system for combating the threat of modernism, a rather broad and somewhat loosely defined collection of philosophical and theological doctrines. The thought of Aquinas, as appropriated by neo-scholasticism, was to be the philosophy and theology taught at Catholic seminaries and colleges. In the wake of that encyclical, there emerged some excellent Catholic philosophical and theological thinking in the neo-scholastic tradition. Neo-scholasticism came to have a real intellectual vitality to it, and for a time it gave the whole Catholic intellectual world and Catholic colleges and universities intellectual coherence, distinctiveness, and clarity about intellectual opponents. As Gleason points out, however, the intellectual vitality of neo-scholasticism was eventually sapped and its coherence unraveled. The vitality was often diminished when taught in countless philosophy and theology classes required at Catholic colleges. Textbooks often presented Aquinas' thought as a system, and in such presentation it lost much of its richness, subtlety, and power. Armies of teachers had to be recruited for the task, and not all had the training and skill to present the material in ways that engendered interest and appreciation. There were complaints by students that such classes were primarily exercises in memorization, something that seems the antithesis of a true philosophical spirit. And on top of this, Thomism came to be seen as, quote, the official teaching, unquote, ecclesiastically and institutionally imposed, and as such, intellectually curious young people almost instinctively resisted it. I personally experienced the antipathy created in the students. When I told older priests at a younger age who had trained in this earlier neo-scholastic system that I was interested in studying Aquinas, they often suspected me of being either intellectually dull, an ecclesiastical sycophant, or both. They encountered Aquinas in dry, formulaic textbooks taught in dull classes that often seem more like indoctrination than the exercise of the true philosophical spirit. They had missed the brilliance and suggestiveness of Aquinas' writing that is seen only through a careful reading of the texts. A second challenge for neo-scholasticism is that the philosophical consensus splintered in the years before the Second Vatican Council. Reginald Marie Garrigou-Lagrange, OP, became the chief proponent of, quote, strict observance Thomism that tended to present Thomism as a coherent, logical system of doctrines whose presentation could be divorced from the texts of Aquinas. Younger scholars, such as Marie-Dominique Chenu and Yves Congar and others, became the leaders of the Nouvelle Théologie, a school that emphasized attention to the historical context of philosophical writing and urged a ressourcement, a return to the study of the classical texts. Jean Maréchal and Karl Rahner, two Jesuits, developed a Thomism influenced by the thought of Immanuel Kant. And Bernard Lonergan, a Canadian Jesuit, combined the thought of Aquinas with the insights of John Henry Newman and Charles Peirce. These are just a few prominent examples. Aeterni Patris envisioned a neo-scholastic unity that could withstand what it saw as the degenerate trends of modern philosophy. But the Thomism it spawned soon became a multiplicity of contending schools of thought, some of which were influenced by the modernist philosophers that encyclical had condemned. I do not see this development as an accident of history, but as reflecting the very nature of philosophical inquiry. As I suggested above, Aquinas' thought is inescapably dialogical. Indeed, I would say this is true of all great philosophical thought. Questions inevitably arise, philosophical thinkers propose theories, and further questions and insights lead them to develop the thought in different ways. All serious philosophy has an open-ended dialogical character about it, and universities are precisely the places that foster and encourage such an open-ended dialogue in pursuit of greater understanding. I would suggest that any attempt to achieve coherence and unity by imposing a particular comprehensive doctrine is bound to fail, for it is inimical to the open-ended character of the human search for truth. Pope John Paul II was himself a Thomist philosopher in the school of phenomenological Thomism influenced by Edmund Husserl and the personalism of Max Scheler. The Holy Father, in his encyclical Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason, offered a similar line of reasoning to the one we have developed above. Pope John Paul wrote, quote, "The Church has no philosophy of her own, nor does she canonize any one particular philosophy in preference to others." The underlying reason for this reluctance is that even when it engages philosophy, even when it engages theology, philosophy must remain faithful to its own principles and methods. Otherwise, there will be no guarantee that it would remain oriented to the truth and that it was moving toward the truth by way of a process governed by reason, unquote. In this encyclical, Pope John Paul focuses on philosophy because of its close relationship with revealed doctrine. Nevertheless, a similar point could be made for physics, psychology, economics, and other fields grounded in human reason. Each of these must be faithful to their respective principles and methods in the search for truth and ought not to be imposed by decree. Looking back at the 20th century in Catholic higher education, Philip Gleason sees the recovery of something like neo-scholastic synthesis as the key challenge facing Catholic colleges and universities. He writes, "The task facing Catholic academics today is from the philosophical and theological resources uncovered in the past half century, a vision that will provide what neo-scholasticism did for many years, a theoretical rationale for the existence of Catholic colleges and universities as a distinctive element in American higher education," unquote. Whatever the theoretical rationale Catholic colleges and universities offer, I do not believe that it will be found through the imposition of a philosophical or theological framework such as neo-scholasticism. The neo-scholasticism of the first half of the 20th century in colleges and universities was not sustainable. Eventually, it fell under its own weight. I doubt that embracing of any single comprehensive philosophical or theological doctrine can provide the coherence and vitality that is sought. I believe, nevertheless, that the Catholic tradition gives us teachings and an intellectual tradition that can orient the education and inform the dialogue of Catholic colleges and universities. I will offer later in the paper some suggestions on qualities we might seek in Catholic colleges to give them that coherence and distinctiveness. But before I do that, what I'm going to do is talk about the broader intellectual landscape. So that was the past. Now I'm going to talk about the broader landscape of our culture in which we live before I go on to the third part. Now this part is a little heavy sledding, but I'm going to gloss it at the end so to let you know what I'm trying to say, I hope. So part two, a detour through the wider landscape. Before we can fruitfully address the questions of coherence of Catholic colleges, we must recognize a certain incoherence of the wider intellectual culture in which we live. For any talk about a distinctive contribution of Catholic colleges must take account of the wider culture which helps shape our institutions and to which we hope to contribute. I will suggest that we live, all of us, our students, our faculty, all of us, in a culture that in profound ways is characterized by incoherence and fragmentation. One could choose many examples to illustrate this broader incoherence, but consider with me one of the most magisterial philosophical efforts in secular philosophy to find some philosophical coherence in our understanding, in the understanding of our wider political community. So this is not colleges and universities, but the whole political community of a country like the United States. John Rawls had perhaps the most authoritative philosophical voice in our times on the theoretical foundations of a liberal democracy like ours. Rawls' 1971 book, A Theory of Justice, was one of the most influential works of political philosophy in the last 100 years. He continued to develop his thought and in 1993 published Philosophical Liberalism, which aspired, in his words, to work out a philosophical conception for political justice, for a constitutional democratic regime that a plurality of reasonable doctrines, both religious and non-religious, liberal and non-liberal, may freely endorse. Okay, so the idea is to sort of have a conception of justice that everybody with various philosophical or religious views could endorse. Rawls' work is magisterial. I will not attempt to review it in anything approaching a comprehensive treatment. I simply want to point out one way in which the work falls short of its ambitious aspiration, and the manner in which that shortcoming reflects the deeper challenge for all of us in our political life. A guiding principle of Rawls' views throughout his career is that the justification for any political system must rely on principles and arguments that cannot reasonably be rejected by any member of the community. In his Political Liberalism, he wrote that a liberal system of government must commit itself to the ideal of practical reason, the ideal of public reason. The notion that citizens must engage one another in a reasoned discussion in which assumptions and inferences are acceptable to all reasonable people. Consider this example. Someone may have a dream, say, and he sincerely believes that dream tells him there's imminent disaster ahead for the nation. Such a person is free to believe that the day of doom is coming and to act on that belief by building a subterranean shelter and storing up supplies. However, because the dream is private, and the dreamer cannot provide publicly accessible reasons for others to believe his apocalyptic vision, his dream cannot be offered in the public community as a reason for the government, say, to build shelters across the nation. Now, so stated, Rawls' restriction on public reason seems unobjectionable. Another's dreams are by nature inaccessible to evaluation by others, and so they cannot provide a basis for action by the political community. But what about religious convictions others do not share, but which are critical in motivating a person to act and in defining the political community in which she or he wants to live? Well, Rawls was criticized for this exclusion of religious beliefs in an earlier edition of Political Liberalism. So in subsequent editions, he added the following proviso to accommodate them. Quote, reasonable comprehensive doctrines. That's like a religious view of the world or a moral view of the world. He says, reasonable comprehensive doctrines, religious or non-religious, may be introduced in public discussion at any time, provided that in due course proper political reasons, and not reasons given solely by the comprehensive doctrines, are presented that are sufficient to support whatever the comprehensive doctrines introduced are said to support. This applies not only to religious doctrines, but, as Rawls emphasizes, to any claim based on another set of reasons. Again, Rawls' claim here is an initial ring of plausibility. I may be a committed Christian, right? And you may be an atheist who embraces utilitarianism. as a moral theory, a comprehensive moral theory. He's saying, I should not argue for my proposal by referring to the sayings of Jesus, but similarly, you should not argue for yours by referring to the sayings of John Stuart Mill, the founder of utilitarianism. Okay? Someone who draws his convictions from religious faith or specific moral or philosophical doctrine cannot simply present these tenets as arguments to those who don't share the same views, unless she or he joins them with what Rawls calls proper political reasons that provide sufficient support for the proposal. However, Rawls' application of this principle quickly shows the limits of his approach. He writes of political liberalism. To maintain impartiality between doctrines, political liberalism does not specifically address the moral topics on which the doctrine divides. Okay? Rawls is saying here that two competing positions derived from different doctrines must somehow be resolved in a way that is neutral among the religious or moral beliefs. Political arguments in Rawls' liberal political society must be neutral about the nature of the good life and thus allow for competing versions to exist. Yet at this point, the allure of the initial plausibility of Rawls' account loses its luster for many. To the extent that we live our lives reflectively, we are guided by an understanding of what the good life is, and by some set of moral principles derived from that understanding. In our society, the nature of the good life and fundamental principles are contested, and so, on Rawls' account, we cannot appeal to them. But if we cannot appeal to them on the moral issues that confront our political community, whether the issue is slavery, the declaration of war, the use of nuclear weapons, abortion, women's rights, same-sex marriage, or any number of other issues, we have no basis for making a decision. Should the United States have dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? There's no position on that issue that can be neutral on the central moral question: what is our duty to protect innocent life? Are there instances where that duty is superseded by higher duty? The difficulty with Rawls' account is that in the quest for a neutral ground of public reason, he has ruled out appeal to common doctrines that are contested. But though contested, these doctrines offer the only basis for making decisions about these questions. The elusiveness of a morally neutral position is pointed out by a philosopher, Michael Sandel, in his book Justice. Sandel takes up the example of abortion. One view says that the desire to make abortion illegal is driven by moral convictions, while the desire to keep abortion legal is driven by a morally neutral position that allows everyone to make their own choices. But both positions on abortions are based to an answer to the moral question: is the unborn baby a human being? Or some may prefer the language, is the fetus a human being? One's language suggests the answer. As Sandel says, the case for permitting abortion is no more neutral than the case for banning it. Both positions presuppose some answer to the underlying moral and religious controversy. There's no neutral basis to adjudicate this very difficult question. Of course, in our society, these questions are usually resolved by appeal to the courts. And the courts oblige us by rendering a decision, often claiming that the decision is made from some position of moral neutrality regarding the fundamental issue in question. Yet those who disagree often find behind the claims of moral neutrality a morally substantive position imposed arbitrarily and less than transparently. Thus, our deepest disagreements often become political battles to elect officials who will appoint judges who will agree with our views. I believe Rawls' ambitious project, quote, to work out a political conception of political justice for a constitutional democratic regime fails because it cannot find a neutral ground between competing and widely shared doctrines of justice and the good human life. We struggle to establish a substantive set of values on genuinely neutral ground. We are thus forced to deal with a great deal of incoherence, this fragmentation of our culture. And this poses a challenge, I think, for secular institutions of higher education. Let me be clear. My friends and colleagues who lead secular colleges and universities are able and conscientious women and men who serve their institutions with skill and dedication. But from my perspective on the sidelines, it seems they are at a disadvantage when it comes to articulating the higher purposes of education at their respective institutions. Certainly, there is broad agreement around the pursuit of academic excellence and the need for academic freedom. Beyond that, however, they often seem to be forced to choose between vacuous, vanilla statements about the arbitrary imposition of a set of values. Because they must remain neutral between competing religious and moral and philosophical understandings, they do not have the luxury that we do at Catholic institutions of appealing to a clear institutional rationale for a stronger statement of the purposes of education and inquiry at their institutions. The danger, however, is that if an institution does not define the purpose of its activities, other forces will. Study after study has shown that a college degree is ever more valuable for enhancing someone's earning power over the course of his or her life. Thus, when we try to justify the cost of education to students and their parents, we tend to speak of the value of a college education in giving a person marketable skills. And so we come to think of education as a commodity which we sell to students and whose value is judged in terms of the financial returns it can bring. One can call this development the commodification of education. With the high cost of education and the financial strains on students and families, I certainly understand them taking a serious look at the returns on their investment in higher education. Yet if this is the only value around which we can find consensus, then the traditional, more noble aspirations of higher education have been lost. Colleges and universities become very high-level technical schools. It's precisely here, I want to argue, that Catholic colleges and universities can make a distinctive contribution, for they can presuppose a richer framework of values to guide their educational efforts. Okay. Now I'm going on to the future, but I mean the point there of that section was just to say, in our very diverse culture with competing views of the world, there's an attempt to remain neutral among values. But that's a problem for secular colleges and universities, because they can't say, what are the higher purposes, right? Because they're contested. But Catholic colleges and universities do have that advantage. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how they can take advantage of that. So the third part, opportunities, treasures new and old. The Catholic faith has its foundation in the doctrine of God's creation of the world out of nothing and the mystery of the redemption through Jesus Christ. These mysteries are proclaimed by the Church under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, and a genuine and full faith in them leads people to serve others in love, which includes the work of education to which Catholic colleges and universities are committed. Reflecting on these central mysteries of the faith, the Catholic tradition has produced an array of teaching on a wide range of human endeavors. A brief review of these teachings would include the dignity and value of every human life, the primacy of the common good in the social order, and the need for solidarity among all people, the central role of the family in society, the dignity of work, the right of the individual to take economic initiative, and the imperative to order the economy to the needs of all. A special love and concern for the poor. The respect for the integrity of creation, including the natural environment. Proper limits on military action and the use of lethal force in conflicts, and the obligation of all to work for peace. And the value of artistic expression in various forms as an expression of the sacramental character of the world. These and other teaching constitute a rich tapestry of values that give direction to the work of education and inquiry at Catholic colleges, at Catholic institutions of higher education. And this is perhaps the greatest advantage for our institutions, for it gives them a rich set of values that are not readily accessible at our secular peers. The communal work of education and inquiry is richer, I submit, to the extent that it is informed by this rich set of values. Now, I believe a Catholic institution is strongest when it is animated by a healthy number of committed Catholic intellectuals. However, I don't want to suggest that every member of a Catholic college or university must be a Catholic and embrace every one of the commitments that come to us from the tradition. Indeed, many of the most valuable and dedicated members of my university, Notre Dame, and perhaps King's too, are not Catholic. Nevertheless, all should understand the mission of our respective institutions. All must understand the mission of our respective institutions and recognize the values arising from the Catholic tradition that help us shape the institution's activities, including its central work of education and inquiry. Various members of the university community play different roles and contribute in different ways to the mission of a Catholic institution. But the institution will flourish, and individuals will flourish in the institution only if all members collectively understand and work together for the success of that mission. Let me emphasize an important point to avoid a serious misunderstanding. In identifying a set of values that are part of the fabric of Catholic teaching and that give direction to the work of a Catholic college or university, I do not want to suggest that in some way they are beyond the range of debate. On the contrary, it is precisely these commitments that can open up the possibility of interesting debate. We can debate, for example, how are we to balance the respect for the integrity of the natural environment with the right to undertake economic initiatives in the free market? How can the protection of the rights of the individual be reconciled with a social order that serves the common good? What are the appropriate limits of the use of lethal force when we're dealing with an amorphous terrorist organization such as Al-Qaeda or ISIS, who do not recognize those limits? How is the fostering of a robust economy to avoid the dangers of corrupting consumerism and neglect for the poor on the margins of that economy? These are difficult questions whose answers are not at all obvious. It is, however, the special role of Catholic colleges and universities to foster informed, rigorous debate about them. Indeed, the commitments of a Catholic institution puts it in a privileged place to engage in such debates in classrooms with students, among faculty, and in scholarly publications. I am claiming that it is not possible for an institution to identify itself as a Catholic institution and not have the fundamental commitments of Catholic teaching shape its central activities. How this influence occurs is a matter of prudential judgment and can be and often is a source of legitimate controversy. But it seems to me that it is not a legitimate controversy to question whether such commitments should play a role. For to deny their role is to render the mission of the institution incoherent. I think the mistake of neo-scholasticism of Catholic colleges and universities of the first half of the 20th century was that it supposed that the Catholic commitments I've spoken of could be maintained, and perhaps only maintained, against cultural threats by the imposition of a more or less fully developed philosophical system. As laudable as the system may have been, and as talented as many of its practitioners were, the effort failed because it failed to appreciate the open-ended character of human inquiry and dialogue, particularly in philosophy. Human learning and inquiry does not proceed by the inculcation of a finished system. We begin from the intellectual heritage that has come down to us, but inquirers much question, raise objections, and offer alternative views. And all the claims must be subject to further debate and criticism. Indeed, this was the method of the disputed question, the form which Thomas Aquinas incorporated in his major works, and it captures his true spirit. The failure of certain strands of neo-scholasticism is that they tried to extract from his writings a finished philosophical and theological system without recognizing the essentially dialogical character of his work. The question, then, is how a Catholic college or university remains committed to certain teaching and fosters vigorous debate that characterizes any serious institution of higher learning. A critical part of the answer to that question involves the concept of a tradition of intellectual inquiry. A tradition is constituted by a set of concepts, assumptions, and practices of a community that grapples with key questions and claims across generations. In advancing this notion, I owe much to the work of Alistair MacIntyre, a philosopher for whom it is a central concept of rational inquiry. Yet we should also note that it is a central concept of a Catholic theological self-understanding. Christianity, of course, is a religion of the book, the Bible, but it cannot be only that. We know that Martin Luther and other Protestant reformers shook up this self-understanding with the principle of sola scriptura, Scripture alone, as authoritative in Christian life. Yet a Catholic response would be that the contents of Scripture were disputed by the Church until the 5th century after Christ. It was only through the discernment of a believing community shaped by traditions of oral learning, liturgy, and practice, and guided by the Holy Spirit that we identified the Scriptures as authoritative. In some sense, then, the authority of Scripture is grounded in the authority of the Church's tradition. Similarly, in other areas of inquiry and in various ways, the tradition of the Christian community grappling with questions over generations can and should inform our teaching and debate. My friend and colleague, John Cavadini, wrote in an excellent article in Commonweal in the fall of 2013, in which he elucidates the notion of tradition with respect to the question of the relationship between the Christian doctrine of creation and the scientific accounts of the origin of the world and human life. Cavadini, a patristic scholar, points out that Jewish and Christian scholars of the 2nd and 3rd century were as troubled and perhaps even more troubled by the creation story in the book of Genesis than we moderns are. They wondered, for example, how could God separate light from darkness in a story before he's created the sun and the moon, the source of light? Or how could we understand an omnipotent God strolling through the garden searching for his creatures? These are what Augustine called questiones that arise from our own reading of Scripture. And the challenge for faith is to seek an understanding that preserves the truth of Scripture and the truth discovered by learned disciplines. Such a quest, which is part of our tradition, has been going on for 2 millennia in Christianity and will continue as questiones arise. These reflections on teaching and tradition are relevant, I contend, to the life and mission of a Catholic college or university, for it is the particular role of a Catholic institution of higher learning to foster such inquiry and discussion in this tradition, enriched by the great thought and writings of previous ages and ready to take on questions that arise in our age. In this way, Catholic institutions can be grounded in the Catholic tradition by being places of vigorous inquiry and debate, and in that making valuable contributions to the Church and the world. Different institutions, of course, will do this in different ways. One important dimension should be the kind of education we offer undergraduate students. Although not all students will be or should be avid theology or philosophy majors, I think all of them should at least be introduced to the riches of the Catholic intellectual tradition in some fashion. Our students should never think that the only options for them regarding faith is a narrow, unquestioning fideism on one hand or an aggressive secularism on the other hand. They should at least be introduced to the subtlety of the thought of Augustine or Thomas Aquinas or John Henry Newman or any number of others. Students interested in healthcare should not only be aware of the formal directives of Catholic medical ethics, but the spirit of a very long tradition of medical care that seeks to alleviate suffering while preserving human dignity and recognizing that death is not the ultimate evil. And students interested in a career in business should have the occasion to encounter Catholic social teaching that seeks to balance the operation of a free market and competitiveness with the sense that, in the words of Pope Benedict, quote, "in commercial relationships, the principle of gratuitousness and the logic of gift as an expression of fraternity can and must find their place within normal economic activity," unquote. Similarly, among the scholarship and debate that are fostered at Catholic colleges and universities should be some that are clearly part of the Catholic tradition. Just what debates an institution wishes to foster depends upon its history, its focus, and its interests. It seems to me, though, that among the primary intellectual concerns of a Catholic college or university must be the presence of a living continuation of the Catholic intellectual tradition. It has often been said that it's a characteristic feature of Catholic tradition that it holds in balance commitments in tension. This is particularly true of Catholic colleges and universities, who hold in tension a commitment to truth received from Catholic teaching with a commitment to robust intellectual debate. Far from being a fatal contradiction, I see this tension as the special strength of Catholic institutions of higher education. For being situated in Catholic intellectual life, they can enjoy the substantive orientation in their academic endeavors that comes from Catholic teaching, while fostering, in the light of a great intellectual tradition going back millennia, serious inquiry and vigorous debate. It was a special gift of Catholic institutions of higher learning that Pope John Paul was referring to, I believe, when he said in Ex Cordia Ecclesiae, his apostolic letter on Catholic higher education, a Catholic university's privileged task, I quote, "A Catholic university's privileged task is to unite existentially by intellectual effort two orders of reality that too frequently tend to be placed in opposition as though they were antithetical: the search for truth and the certainty of already knowing the fount of truth," unquote. In other words, perhaps the role of a Catholic college or university is to join in the quest of faith seeking understanding, and to help our students undertake and find joy in that quest. The task is a challenge, but it is even more a gift and an opportunity to offer what is so sorely needed in our age. We must strive to be worthy of the calling and to make our institutions like the scribe trained for the kingdom of heaven, who, in the words of the Gospel of Matthew, can bring out of treasures what is new and what is old. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Father Jenkins for that excellent talk. Father Jenkins is happy to take questions. We have a student, I see him here, who has a handheld microphone, so he'll come and find you. So please, if you'd like to ask, raise your hand and we'll do our best to recognize you. And I see Dennis O'Brien already, so please, would you come here?
Real great.
First of all, as the president, having the past president of two secular institutions, I want to thank you for the nice words you said about us. And then I want to also acknowledge, I think, your point about being the president of a Catholic institution. I think that for me, the advantage of the Catholic institution is it raises questions which are much more difficult to raise within secular institutions. And the problem with the old neo-scholasticism was it gave you the answers real quick.
Exactly.
There are no questions unless there's some sense of where the answer is directed. Not that you have the answer, but you know how to go forward. This is a fruitful form of investigation. And that's the dialectical character of what you were talking about in Aquinas and what got lost in Neo-Scholasticism. So I would want to simply qualify slightly what you said by saying it seems to me the value of the Catholic institution is in one sense to say these are very important questions, and they're not empty questions. They're not answered questions yet, but if we don't continue to talk about them, we will be really lost. And so I just want to avoid the suggestion that somehow or other the Catholic institution possesses the answer. And I'm sure that's not what you want to say, but there are other institutions like old University of Chicago where there was the idea that somehow the great books would substitute the same sense of an overall framework for raising questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Dennis, you kind of summarized succinctly what I want to say, and I want to thank you for that. I mean, would you agree? I don't know if you agree. I mean, in a way, the tension is this. If you start from an absolutely neutral position in education, you don't know what you're trying to accomplish. I mean, what is success if you're absolutely neutral among any values, right? So that you want to avoid that. But on the other hand, I think you're saying you can't. The problem, maybe Neo-Scholasticism or other things, is sort of you have the answers. Okay, you guys just memorize those, go home, and And so, in a way, what I think we both agree, and I'm trying. The challenge of a Catholic college and university is to hold in balance a substantive view of the human good and the world with robust, open dialectical inquiry, and that's tough. I mean, any of the extremes are easier, but that's why it's interesting. I don't know if that's okay. Good. Thanks.
I'm going to ask you to, Jim Keating from Providence College, I'm going to ask you to sharpen your statements on Neo-Scholasticism. Mm-hmm. The idea there was that there would be some foundational ideas about the nature of reality, which of course would come from not only the classical tradition of philosophy, but also as it was informed by revelation. And therefore the questions would go out from there. Now, obviously it could be abused, and it was abused, right? But to replace it, and I know you're not trying to do this, but I'm curious on how one doesn't come to this, that in Catholic education, what you have are, you can ask more questions than in a secular place. You can ask whether God exists, or whether abortion is immoral, or something like that. But the Neo-Scholastic was, you come with some sort of philosophical presuppositions. Mm-hmm. At one point, you mentioned in your talk Catholic intellectuals. Now, Catholic intellectuals, you would assume, come with some presuppositions of which then they discuss matters. I'm just wondering how you can, if you're not going to have Neo-Scholasticism, which is so gone, there's no point in talking about it. What is going to replace that starting point, those basic convictions? Because it seems to me if you don't have those basic convictions, you're teaching questioning, which I'm not really sure where that goes or how that's distinctive.
It's a great question, and let me try to answer it. I think the problem with Neo-Scholasticism, just an aside, is that I think you had the strict observance of Gregory Lagrange, who kind of wanted to put a system in a textbook removed from Aquinas and just teach it. And I think there was a reaction against that by people like Chenu and the Nouvelle Theologie, and then really interesting developments by people like Rahner and Lonergan and others kind of to develop. So, in a way, it was sort of what we don't want a finished system we kind of impose, but what replaces it? I think that's your question. I guess I'd like to say two things. I mean, obviously, there's sort of the what's central to the teachings of the faith. And I'm talking about the kind of central truths of the faith. But I do want this idea of a tradition, right? And I know you may see that as a little slippery, but I think we can identify a kind of history of thought going through the great thinkers that can orient our thought, and that we can find disagreements in that tradition, but also consensus. We can find open questions, and we can find some resolution. I think education, Catholic education, is a matter of, in a sense, incorporating that tradition into your intellectual life so that your dialogue is oriented, you find yourself continuing that dialogue. So I think that's it. I mean, Dennis mentioned Chicago. We had the great tradition of the great books, but as we all know, we academics know that the canon is contested, that any canon is challenged. Well, we got a canon. And I think there are various levels of the teaching, but I think it does give us something between the sort of completely closed system and the utterly presuppositionalist open view of whatever. So I do think, I know for my students, I mean, taking students through Augustine's Confessions, it is, I mean, if you can get them to understand what Augustine's answering and how he's grappling, it is an exciting intellectual experience. And if our students can have that experience that I had with Aquinas, with Professor McNamara, that had as much impact on my intellectual life as any list of being hammered, truths being hammered into my head. You have to engage it. It has to become part of your intellectual life. And in a way, as difficult as it is, I think that's the goal of Catholic education.
Thanks for a great talk. I have
Great.
two questions. Without naming universities or presidents, could you talk a little bit about whether, in your conversation with secular peers, they chafe a little bit at this vacuous rhetoric? The humanities colleagues I know at universities that are top 10 universities, they chafe at the reduction of excellence to external funding and quantitative measures. The second question is, I think there's a line in Fides et Ratio where John Paul says that one of the great aspects of philosophy is it gives us a language with which we can speak with others who don't share our faith. And the question is, once you develop that internal dialogue where people share the tradition, what strategies exist to draw on that tradition to enter the pseudo-neutral sphere of politics?
Yeah.
And make the case in a way that's persuasive?
That's a great questions, Mark. I would say, in answer to the first, yeah, I think there is. I mean, among the people I'm closer to, some of whom are Catholics or some who are religious people, I think there's there's sort of envy that we can speak about that. Obviously, I don't need to tell you, it gets us into controversies that others can avoid. But I think there is an envy. And I could name 10, I'll bet, college presidents who I've spoken to about this. So I think that's true. And I think your second point is absolutely right. I mean, it's absolutely right. If it's precisely the ability to engage questions, to entertain an undecided question, hold intention to various answers, that gives us the ability to engage a secular peer. Because if all we can do, and I will say this, I am critical of a certain fideism in the religious life of this country. I'm not talking about just Catholics. I mean, that all we can do is tell them what the truth is. Well, that goes nowhere, right? I mean, that kind of conversation is utterly unfruitful. But if you can teach people to engage in that dialogue, to understand, even though I don't agree with position A, I can understand the persuasiveness of position A, then I'm better able to dialogue with someone. I owe this point to McIntyre, but he talks about Aquinas. I mean, to be able to state the objection to your position in a more persuasive way than your opponent stated it is a great skill. And I think that's a skill we should teach our students. You know, what's wrong with it? What's the strongest objection? Can you put that persuasively? And that will allow you to engage in conversation more fruitfully. So thanks for that question. Good point.
I'm Regan Reitzman from King's College here. Now, the following question, I don't know if it would be a fair question or be grounded in a fair reading of your talk, but I'm kind of curious how you would respond to it. Imagine you had two different colleges. One's a Catholic college, King's, Misericordia, Notre Dame, and another college was also grounded in a thick, comprehensive view of the world, but not a Catholic one. J.S. Mill University. Or Hillsdale sometimes poses itself as a politically conservatively grounded university. So now I'll ask the kind of question that Father Ryan was talking about when he was introducing you. What's the difference in saying Catholic here? Is the argument, you know, this is, again, that might not be fair, but is the argument that what makes Catholic education special is it has a thick way it approaches questions and a notion of rationality and a set of values? Or is there something even more to your account than that being Catholic matters not just being thick? So there's a real difference between the Catholic school still and J.S. Mill University. So.
That's a very fair question, and it's a good point. I think one could have a secular philosophy or view of the world and create an educational institution on that basis. And I don't know about this institution you mentioned, but yeah, that would be possible. And they would have the advantage of being able to say, here's what we're trying to accomplish in our educational and research efforts. I would say we have a slight advantage. I mean, I think we have some challenge, but a slight advantage in that we can point to this rich tradition of 2 millennia. And I think it's harder to do that if if you sort of have a kind of certain politically defined ideology, say. I mean, I think, if you can point to Augustine and Aquinas and Newman and, Teresa of Avila and Catherine of Siena, and, that's a pretty good lineup, and I could go on. And I'm not sure, so I like, that's my team, and I like my team, I'd say. But if you've got a team, bring them out here, and we'll talk. Yeah.
Thank you. Dominic Balestra from Fordham University. Father, thank you for that talk. And here's what I saw at the heart of yours, and this question of neo-scholasticism. There's a tendency or desire, we want something to anchor us that's unchanging. Mm-hmm. But you stressed when you came, what lit you up by Aquinas, and I think when you were right, when you read the text and not the manuals, this guy's in a process of Q&A and objection and reply. It's the mind at work, given the glory of God's creation. What a gift. Well, what we now see is enough of a history where we realize at the core of, even on the faith side of Catholicism, no one has completed the meaning that we attest to as the truth. And I think that's got to be at the core. Because what I see today, I don't know what to call them, the secular universities, the postmodern, they've abandoned the notion of truth, even as an ideal to be pursued. Bernard Williams talks in this wonderful book, Truth and Truthfulness. If you don't enter into it, the inquiry, with a sense of truthfulness, which acknowledges what Socrates knew.
Yeah.
And I think what Jesus knew as a human. It's not finished, it's only begun. And I think we are at renewing the beginning. I don't know where I want to go with this except to say we can't try to go back to, and you said this too, a core that you impose on people.
I think that's a good point, and it just sparks a couple thoughts in my mind. I mean, yeah, I do reflect on this. Why did universities arise in a totally Catholic culture? That seems to me an historical fact. Europe, 13th century, that's when they started to spring up these institutions devoted to teaching and inquiry. Why did that happen in a completely Catholic culture? I mean, that seems counterintuitive in a kind of secular view. But I take it it's because of, that idea that we have minds and the universe, and the truth always is sort of beyond our grasp, and so inquiry is the way to do it. So I think that's a great, and I guess I have to say, and kind of I've touched on this talk, I do think there is in our time a certain yearning for that kind of closed truth, and I do think it manifests itself, with all respect to colleagues, as a certain fideism that wants to say, here are the answers, learn it, love it, live it. That's it. And I think the genius of the Catholic tradition, and the reason why there are Catholic colleges and universities, is because that sort of open-ended character of the truth, that sense of mystery to the world, that sense that we always have to go beyond the current understanding to something further, is really at the heart of what this tradition is about. And it's that which we at Catholic colleges and universities must capture, and we must proclaim, and we must educate our students in, because I think the fruitless conflict between the fideism and the aggressive secularism goes nowhere.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful, inspiring
Thank
talk,
you.
at least for me, as a philosopher also, and most enthusiastically encouraged by what you said. And I agree, as an undergraduate at Fordham, it was my philosophy class that excited me about Thomism, etc. And however, I think today in Catholic higher education, having been in it for so many years, it seems to me that many of the institutions represented here are from small institutions. I'm from Villanova. It's somewhat larger, but it's still a small institution. And I think we've gone through a period when we tried to mimic, if you will, many of the secular institutions. And hence, that was part of, I think, our demise in some ways because of the hiring process. We hired people in many of our departments who did not know the tradition. And so we're at a loss today to replace them. The ones who did know the tradition are older. So that leads, I think, to a question about hiring for mission. You mentioned that you need a core of critical Catholic intellectuals, which we need. We need other people too, but I think we also need to be very aware of the values that we're proposing when we say who we are. Are we trying to mimic a secular institution without really addressing the value of the kinds of questions you're raising that a liberal arts tradition would encourage us to raise when we speak to parents on Candidates Day and all that sort of thing? I think we've grown through a period of being embarrassed about who we are because it's too Catholic, without an appropriate sense of pride in a resource that we offer people that they wouldn't get elsewhere. And so we don't say that. So I think that at Notre Dame, I believe, you have a process for hiring for mission that most of people in small institutions do not have. The second thing is working with, and this is my last thing, with we have a kind of great books. It's not a great books. We say that our Augustine Culture Seminar over 2 semesters first year is important. But I have some real critical questions and reservations because I think as Catholic institutions, we need to develop a canon for modernity and contemporary thought. Mm-hmm. You mentioned some of the thinkers, but we need that, and we can't go back to Catherine of Siena and Thomas. We do that in ancient and medieval. But we really need to crystallize and bring to the forefront, in a way, MacIntyre is certainly good, After Virtue and so on, but we really need to crystallize more and more on a kind of canon for modernity and contemporary thought so that it's not always defaulted to Nietzsche. So
Yeah.
what advice could you give us, or even maybe formation of a committee that could do this? Because I really think that this is a critical question what do we offer students who are studying in a required course that is supposed to reflect our mission? That's
Yeah, that second question is a big one, and I don't know if I can be terribly helpful on that. I just look at my friend. I sort of do ancient medieval, so but I teach some of that more recent thought, and I think we do need to think about it. I guess I won't. I do think, you can read the kind of postmodernists as a critique of sort of certain Enlightenment thinkers who themselves were kind of introduced as secularism, and there may be a possibility for discussion, to open a discussion, but that's a fleeting thought. I'm not sure it's a very good one. But I'll go back to your first question, which is a little easier to answer. I think we just have to keep articulating the mission, and I think it's a heck of an attractive mission. I mean, and I will say this at Notre Dame, and Mark Roach pointed out to me, if we look at the faculty we've hired that could have gone to, say, your more prestigious institution, Yale or Princeton or Stanford or Harvard, why are they at Notre Dame? It's almost always because of the mission. And we can't pay them more, or we can't, provide any, but they want to be at a place that has a more rich sense of its educational purpose. And some it's religious, some it's not. Some it's not. Some who aren't religious but want to be part of that broader context. And so I think it's that is going to help us be academically stronger. But it is a matter of articulating what we're doing in a way that's credible and living it.
Hello, thank you for the remarks. I'm Ellen Boylan, and I'm from Marywood University in Scranton.
Okay.
And my research now for about a decade is to measure constructs of mission and compare Catholic and independent colleges. Mm-hmm. And I do find differences and so on. So my question is, and it relates to yours, your comment that some chafe at the concept, at the thought of measuring Catholic identity. Do you think it can be done? Do you think attempts at quantitatively measuring Catholic identity is a worthy endeavor, and it can be accomplished?
Well, that's a great question. It's something I thought about. We've sort of shifted at Notre Dame to stop talking about metrics and start talking about indicators, because I think people chafe at the idea you can put numbers on these things. But I think you can. Whenever you have a complex institution, you're looking what are the things that you regularly monitor to see where you're going, and I think you can identify some. They won't capture everything. But they will give you some indication of how you're doing. So I say I'm a moderate on measurements. That is, I don't think they answer every question, but I don't think they're irrelevant. So I think you can come up with those. And in a way, it depends on the institution. It depends on what you're trying to do. And ask yourself, okay, if we're successful, what are we going to look at in 10 years? What's going to count as success? And once you answer that question, I think you can come up with some indicators. And some may be subjective.
One last question?
Yeah, great.
One last.
I'm Tom Shannon, retired professor of ethics at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, now living here. One of the words that I'm hearing is a singular tradition or identity. And if you go to the scholastic tradition, and prior to that, you have traditions. You have schools of theology. You have schools of philosophy. Slightly different, maybe debating over insignificant things, but the Franciscan tradition in which I was educated was a wisdom tradition, as opposed to a more philosophic, scientific tradition. Different emphasis, different nuance. I think one of the things that's hindered a lot of the discussion is a singular noun. We forgot that there is richness in the tradition that there are many articulations of it. And I think if we first of all engage that within the Catholic communities, we are then much better prepared to engage that in the secular society. So I just, a word to remember the plural of tradition.
Yeah, I mean, would it be fair to say what your suggestion, which I agree with, is to try to find plurality and unity, right? It's not uniformity we're looking for, but plurality, as you say, is okay. But there has to be some connection, some commonality in the search for truth. So, hey, thanks very much for listening to me, and thanks for coming.
All right, don't go quite yet. So it's 10 o'clock. We have a break for about a half hour. At 10:30, we have our first panel discussion involving 3 panelists and a moderator. This will be an opportunity to pursue further some of the questions raised in the Q&A and in Father Jenkins' talk. So lots of opportunity. Please.
Announcements for those of you who are guests at King's today. There are restrooms on this floor through those exits, as well as on the first floor for your use. If you are a registered participant and have not yet received your folder and your name tag, please do so at the table during the break so that we can get a good sense of who has arrived and who we might need to look for and find later today. And if you have any questions, we have some students here who are ambassadors for the day who will be out in the lobby area. Please feel free to ask any of those questions at any time.
And we'll try to start promptly at 10:30. If we could flick the lights, we would. I don't think we can, so just please come back in 10:30. Thank you.